on this computer. All right, well, hi everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Carol Stringer, the Fulton County Agricultural Natural Resources Agent. Thanks for joining us. This is going to be the first webinar in a 4-part series on backyard poultry. So if you're interested, you can go back to the same Eventbrite page and register for the other sessions if those topics interest you. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Casey Ritz. He is a professor of poultry science and extension program coordinator. And our first topic tonight is going to be foundations of small flock management. So without further ado, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me just fine. As Carol mentioned, this is a first of a 4-part series, and actually a lot of the some of the discussion that I would probably normally have on just a one-night program, we're going to put into other webinars, and so there's going to be some natural breaks in some of the discussion that we have tonight. And certainly, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to look at those other webinars that we have coming up in the following weeks. But tonight, let's start with foundations of small flock management. And see if there we go. I can never remember how to advance my slides. I've got a Mac, and sometimes it doesn't want to do the same thing as a PC will do. So raising a few chickens. Why chickens? Why do people have interest in raising a small flock of chickens? And it's an interesting thing, really. And we see this every time the economy takes a downturn or something like that. Whenever we see the price of goods and services increase, there's always followed by an increase in homegrown products. And there's some interesting components about that, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But we see this time and time again, a lot of people wanting to and hoping to maybe save a little bit of money if they raise their own products at home. Well, it's interesting, over the years, even the federal government has gotten involved with raising backyard chickens. These are some advertisements from back in both the First World War and Second World War, with USDA telling us it's our patriotic duty to raise chickens and to do our part in that effort with the economy. And really, this past couple of years, maybe it's been the same, particularly this last year with COVID. Maybe there's some truth to that. The types of poultry, I show you this slide just to drive home one point, and that is that on a scale of from scavenger, which is, we'll say, a wild bird or wild chicken, a wild game bird, to our commercial birds, there's a array of different components that go into raising poultry. And we want our small flock birds, there's nothing wrong with them being a semi-scavenger, kind of there in the middle, but we don't want them to be a scavenger. We don't want them to kind of be on their own. We want to do everything that we can when we're raising our birds to optimize their performance, their growth potential, and their genetic potential they have as a chicken. And so what inputs we need to add, or what kind of quality things we need to do to help our birds grow and perform, is all part of that, the way that we handle our birds. Now, from a consumer point of interest, we're seeing a lot of both commercially and small flock, from a small flock standpoint, we're seeing a lot of different points of interest that people have. Fix my slide there for a sec. We see people expressing a desire to have environmentally friendly products, or they want their chickens to have an all vegetable diet, which is an interesting thing. and the main question is for you, if I guess the first quiz is, are chickens vegetarians? And of course, the answer is they're not. So why would we, why would we give them a all vegetable diet? Organically raised, concerns about animal well-being, and a lot of interest in local sourcing, people wanting to buy foods and products that are produced close to where they live. And because of some of these points of interest, we're seeing some premium priced products that are on the market, and that people with small flocks are even getting into that kind of action. So here's an example, and this is from an actual advertisement from an actual carton of eggs from Atlanta. And the words are on the carton, there are USDA organic, pasture raised, certified humane, 1/3 less cholesterol, ethical eggs from happy hens raised on native grasses. So your quiz question, first one here. How much do you think these are going for? What is the price on these eggs? Now, I know we're going to be keeping I think all the questions you might have are going to be held to the end. So if you want ask a question by chat feature, Carol will check those, and then we'll also open up at the end for your questions. But the answer is $8.69 a dozen. So somebody's paying a lot of money for some pretty flowery words there. We'll talk about that in a second. But because of some of these premium products we're seeing, we've also seen over 20% increase in specialty products that are being produced over the last 10 years or so. But it's still, even with this increase in specialty products, it's still less than 2% of the market share, meaning that people still want, as a general rule, the American public wants economy priced foods over the specialty high dollar products. So I have some slides that are I've given over the years that have actually been pretty popular when we talk about small flocks and alternative poultry. And so let's go through these, and then we'll get into some of the specifics about actual management practices we need to consider. So these are some of the urban myths. I call them urban myths and legends about homegrown poultry products. And they start with cholesterol going all the way down to they're cheaper to produce if I raise my own birds. Again, thinking back on when the economy goes bad, maybe I can produce them a little bit, save a little bit of money by producing my own products. So let's start with cholesterol. We hear a lot about people saying that if they produce their own birds, or they give them a vegetarian diet, they'll have less cholesterol in the eggs. Well, let's see what the truth of that is. And the answer really is, in the end, an egg is an egg is an egg. If it's a chicken egg, it's going to have those nutritional facts that you see there on the right. And it's going to have 70 calories per egg. These are for a standard large size egg. It's going to have 185 milligrams of cholesterol, and it's going to have 16 grams of protein and 5 grams of fat. That's an egg. That is what an egg is. And a couple brand new studies have come out just this last year, one from the Mayo Clinic and the other from the Journal of the American Heart Association, talking about cholesterol in eggs, and that really it's that natural cholesterol that's in the egg doesn't seem to be nearly as much as an issue as trans fats and saturated fats from other sources. And the Journal of the American Heart Association found no significant association between egg consumption and mortality in US adults. So that's an interesting thing. That's a myth that's been around for a very long time about the cholesterol in eggs, but really in reality, it really isn't an issue. Now, I also took, so here's standard run-of-the-mill eggs in the store and nutritional facts. Here are the nutritional facts from a box of pastured eggs and a box of vegetarian fed eggs and fed birds, and then some cage-free birds. And what do you notice from all from all these nutritional facts? They're the same. In the end, a chicken egg is a chicken egg, and the nutritional value is what it is. Well, what if we do organic and free range and their heritage breed? Certainly, that's got to be better, right? Nope, same thing. It really doesn't matter when it comes down to it. What you do with that chicken, it's still a chicken, and it's going to produce an egg that has that nutritional profile that is genetically designed to have. And that was just putting another way. You could say it in every language in the world. That's kind of what I was trying to imply in here. That the nutritional facts of the egg is they are what they are, and an egg is an egg. Okay, what about healthier and safer? If I produce my own small flocks, my own eggs and own meat, it'll be healthier and safer for me. Really what we've found over the years through a number of studies is that because of a lack of knowledge sometimes and consistent production practices, we often find that bacteria and viruses tend to be more prevalent in small backyard flocks than in our commercial flocks that we have. And it often is tied to inadequate nutrition. And that's why nutrition is so very important, why we're going to have a standalone talk about poultry nutrition in a couple of weeks. And if you want to find out the backstory of that picture down there, tune in 2 weeks and we'll talk about that. Hormone free. If I raise my own birds and eggs, they will be hormone free. That's another fallacy that really has been around for a long time that we've had a hard time dispelling. Really, hormone free is a misnomer. There's no such thing as hormone free. But it's genetics and not added hormones or feed hormones that have made the modern bird. Now that picture down there that you see, those are actual genetic birds. The bird on the left is a 1957 genetic line that we maintain at our research farm. And then the bird on the right is a 2012 commercial bird. They were both commercial birds in their day. And those birds were the same age, fed on the same feed, and processed at the same time. And you can see the massive difference in those two birds. And that has come about simply by genetic selection, and added hormones play no role in that process. In fact, it's against federal regulation that we utilize hormones, even if they were effective, and they aren't in the case of poultry. Another myth and legend, fresher. Well, fresher, if you're consuming your eggs and your meat, within a couple of days, then certainly that is the case. But we consume enough eggs in the United States, about 289 per person in reality, that all commercial eggs that are in the store are at least a grade A. And so they are also very, very fresh and healthy for you as well. Now, if you're interested in knowing how old that egg is that you buy in the store, they have an expiration date on the carton. Then they also have what is called the Julian date. And the Julian date down here, that is a number, that 3-digit number right there, I'm circling with my pointer. That is the day of the year that those eggs were packaged. And so if you buy them on, in this case, it's the 024, that means January 24th. So if you buy them on, say, 029, then you know those eggs are only 5 days old from the time they were packaged. So that's one way you can tell the freshness of an egg in the grocery store. Better flavor. I talk to people all the time too that say they like the flavor of backyard or barnyard eggs, that they have more intense egg flavor, and that's very true. There's no doubt about it. Flavor, you are what you eat when it comes to chicken, and flavor and color are fat soluble molecules that are feed dependent. So whatever those chickens are eating, particularly whatever fat source they're eating, any flavor molecules that are attached to those fat molecules will also then in a proportion end up in the egg yolk, because the egg yolk is fat. And so for example, fish meal is a very good feed for poultry. They do very well on it. We can only feed about 10% fish meal max without, and if we go beyond that, we start getting fishy flavors in the yolk of the egg, and nobody wants that. So now the eggs here on the screen, one of the questions, one of the things I've seen on the internet as well, can you pick the healthy hen? Which was the healthiest hen? The answer is they're all from a healthy hen. It's just what they were fed, and the color molecules that are associated with their feed are expressed here. The egg on the far left, the hens were fed a wheat-based diet. There's very little keratin and xanthophyll, those color molecules in wheat, and so it's a very pale egg. Whereas you have on the far right a very bright, deep orange color. That comes from more of a pasture-raised bird that has access to greens, such as green grass, and those xanthophylls and carotenoids that are in grass and other greens then get transferred into the egg. And so it's those color molecules in the feed that are expressed in that egg yolk. Here's the last one of these slides, cheaper, the urban myth and legends. If I raise my own birds for eggs and meat, it'll be cheaper. And in reality, this is a stark reality that that's not true. Production costs really are significantly higher than commercial operation on a per unit basis because of the input costs. And they typically are, for the first year of somebody, say, wanting to produce their own birds, they're going to be somewhere between $8 and $12 a dozen that first year. So I put together just a little example here at the bottom, and I took the most conservative approach I could take. So if I bought chickens, and I bought, I think in this case it was 3 chickens. So yeah, 3 hens, $3 a piece, and I spent only $500 on a coop. Made it mostly out of scrap metal. You can even be cheaper than that. And I fed them some feed and maybe bought a few pieces of equipment that I needed. So a conservative cost then for 3 hens for that first year would be about $560. Well, if they essentially produce an egg every day or 4 days a week for 52 weeks, then the price of those eggs is going to be $10.77. Well, if you remember back on when we talked about those fancy worded eggs at the very beginning of the presentation at $8.69, there's no way we maybe would go to the store and buy that or pay that. But oftentimes, if we're not careful, we'll be paying more than that as we begin our flock. Now, certainly, as the flock goes along, and if you're conservative with the costs that you put into it, you can certainly raise them for or produce eggs for less than that. But this is just kind of giving you an example that you need to be careful on how much you spend on your birds if you're trying to save some money. I gave this presentation a number of years ago in Forsyth County, and a fellow in the back of the class laughed out loud, and he said, "I think I'm up to $40 a dozen with all the improvements he said his wife was having to do to the coop." So you have to be careful. You'll spend a lot of money on your eggs. So what about the difference based on shell color? Brown eggs, white eggs, blue eggs, they're all the same nutritional profile. They all have the same grading scale when it comes to USDA. Historically, there's regional differences. I grew up on the West Coast, and we essentially had just white eggs. Here in New England, on the Atlantic seaboard, brown eggs have been the preference for a number of years. And really, from a physical standpoint, the brown egg shells tend to be a little bit thicker. They come from bigger hens. And because they come from bigger hens, and those bigger hens lay fewer eggs a year, and they consume more feed, it costs more per egg to produce a brown egg because of those feed costs. And so that's really, in the end, that's the only difference between the egg color, shell color, is the amount of feed input it takes to produce those eggs. Some people just like to have a menagerie of color and hens in their backyard, and that's perfectly fine. There's certainly some very fun and unique things that we can achieve with a small flock, and showing here all the different colors of eggs that some of our backyard chickens can lay. Well, here's your second quiz. How do we know what color of an egg a chicken's going to lay? So based on the chicken on the left and the chicken on the right, which will lay a brown egg and which will lay a white egg? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. And the answer is neither one, right? They're both roosters. So neither one's gonna lay an egg. But if you, those jokes never fall good when nobody laughs on Zoom. But anyway, we call this a part of the bird the earlobe. And so on birds that have a red earlobe, they're going to lay a brown egg, and the birds that have a white earlobe essentially are going to lay a white egg, based on the part of the world where those breeds and classes of chickens were originally developed. So when we start thinking about our small flock, we need to think about what we want them for. What's our focal point? Do we just want provide for our family needs? Do we want some volume? Do we want to fill up the freezer? Maybe have some extra? Do we want to tap into some of those high-priced, especially niche markets? And certainly you can do that with a small flock. You don't have to be big to tap into some of those things. Maybe you want to do some subscription farming. We have some folks around the Athens area that actually grow the products for people who live in the city, for example, and then on a given day they'll come and collect their product and that was raised fresh on a nearby farm. So those kind of things are possible too. But one thing we need to take into consideration: are there any ordinances or restrictions, neighborhood covenants that may be in place that would prohibit from either having poultry or restricting how we can keep them? So let's talk about those for just a minute. When it comes to chicken ordinances, and Georgia's kind of gone through the motions and turmoil of counties addressing these issues over the last several years. But it all comes down to 4 concerns that county commissions and planning boards and neighbors have over small flock chickens. And so these are the 4 concerns that say they're going to be noisy, they're going to smell, that they'll bring in pests, and that they'll decrease property values. So let's dispel these myths as well. So let's talk about noise. How are we going to reduce the concern over noise? Well, that's, I think, an easy one. And that's where we would have maybe a county or a municipality would have what we would call a rooster ban. You can have chickens, but you can't have a rooster. And certainly you don't need a rooster to have eggs. Hens are going to lay eggs whether there's a rooster anywhere or not. Now, if you want fertile eggs and you want chicks to produce chicks from your eggs, of course, you're going to need a rooster. But we don't need a rooster to produce meat and eggs in the backyard. So that certainly can be one way of solving those issues. Concern over smell. What can we do with that? What a lot of counties and municipalities have done, they've had a bird limit per acre, or bird limit for a parcel. They've issued sanitary guidelines, all of which certainly can address some of those issues and concerns that they might have with regard to smell from manure or a coop. Concern over pests, and we're primarily talking about rodents and other those type of pests that might come in and get into other people's buildings and such. Well, certainly, I think the number one thing we can do is to have covered, secure feed containers. If the rodents or wild birds don't have access to the feed, then they're not going to be attracted to that area. And so that's, I think, another easy fix that we can do to alleviate some of those concerns. Now, what about property values? People say, well, if my neighbor is allowed to have chickens, and if I decide that I want to sell my property, I won't be able to do it, or if I do, it will be a reduced price. I think, personally, I think it's what I'll call unfounded realism. Maybe there's a little bit of both there, kind of depending on how well those backyard birds are taken care of. But I really don't think, in any real sense, that having a few chickens is going to reduce your neighbor's property value at all. And so I think that's an unfounded concern that they have. But what we do see across the counties, municipalities, there's no standard trend for any kind of chicken ordinance. Now in Fulton County, we look through the regulations that were in Fulton County. Now this is for urban, downtown, essentially, Atlanta, Fulton County. Chickens are allowed, but here are the stipulations for birds. One of the first is that any housing or enclosure, it must be well drained, free from accumulations of animal excrement and objectionable odors, and otherwise clean and sanitary. Well, that's kind of vague, right? What does it mean, free from accumulation of manure? I mean, you can't get out there every day in your chicken coop and clean up. That's just not practical. I think the statement here is that we make sure that we don't have objectionable odors that might be bothering people in the neighborhood, and just keep the area clean and looking good. Second, it says animal excrement shall be disposed in a manner that is approved by Fulton County or its designee. I could not find anywhere in the municipal code what is an approved manner for disposal of animal manure. So I'm not sure how to answer that question at all. That might require a call to the Fulton County, but certainly a reasonable manner for a small flock would be to put it into the vegetable garden or flower beds, or even bag it up and put it in the trash for the landfill. All would be appropriate. Poultry must be kept 25 feet away from buildings other than those that are owned by the chicken owner, by the resident. And that's actually very, very lenient. And so as long as you keep your chicken coop 25 feet away from your property line or from other buildings, then you'll be fine. Chickens each must have a minimum of 4 square feet. I was trying to think if I've ever seen a stipulation for that anywhere else, and I couldn't find any that I had in my records. So that's kind of a new one, but certainly plenty of space for a chicken to have and to need and be just fine. And then the last one is a maximum of 75 birds on a property. Didn't stipulate what size that property had to be, but the maximum number of birds would be 75. So that's for Fulton County. And those were, I think, established in 1990. So that, they're still on the books, at least in the municipal code. But wherever you live, you want to check first with the county or with the city that you're in before you get started purchasing, buying, and planning, just to make sure that you have everything in order that you can actually keep those birds, and if there are any restrictions on what you need to do to keep them. So let's talk about some need to know management basics then. First off, chickens, baby chicks, when they're first born, they can't fully self-regulate their own body temperature, and so they need supplemental heat. That's why, laying hens, they brood their birds. The chicks will crawl in under her feathers to keep warm, that kind of thing. And so we need to, when we buy chicks or get chicks from somewhere else, they need to start out somewhere at least 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They need to have access to that level of heat. And then as they grow older, we need to step that heat down each week. And 5 degrees each week is a good benchmark to look for. We also, when they're very young, we need to keep drafts off them. So a draft shield is good. The cardboard ring on the right is a good example of a good brooding pen. They have a heat source, but they can get away from it if they want to cool down. And then there's, of course, food and water for them in there as well. So very important that we provide that heat for those chicks. As far as light goes, and particularly for our laying hen breeds, they need to grow well. They need 12, at least 12, 14, I prefer 14 hours of light a day. And as you're laying hens, and you'll hear more about this on the laying hen presentation as well, but they need that number of hours to be maintained in order for them to continue laying eggs, even during the winter months. So when the light decreases in the fall, that level of light needs to be maintained if you want egg production to continue. From a space standpoint, again, Fulton County, a minimum of 4 square feet per bird. Confinement is preferred, and I say that because oftentimes birds that are free ranging, free roaming have greater chance of contracting disease from wild birds or other sources from soil, those kind of things as well. So if at all, confinement is my preferred method for management, for brooding. And bedding material is important too. Pine shavings or sawdust is preferred. The last thing you want to use is newspaper. Newspaper is too slick, especially for little chicks, and they will slip on it and can easily essentially sprain, dislocate a hip, and they'll be forever lame because of a slick bedding. So pine shavings or sawdust is preferred. We need to protect our birds from weather, predators, injury, even theft. So we need a good, secure place that they can seek refuge, particularly at night. My recommendation is at least 2.5 feet per bird. Again, Fulton County is 4 feet. Easy access to clean feed and clean water, very important. And then we talked about that light, both natural and electric, needed for hens. And then good ventilation is needed too for moisture and ammonia control in our pens. I think one of the best ways for water delivery is through we call these nipple drinkers, where the hens, even chicks, learn from day one how to peck that trigger right there and then get fresh, clean water. There's nothing wrong with these bell waters. They certainly can get water from them, but they get dirty very quickly. And you'll spend a lot more time cleaning these bell type waters than you would these either gravity fed or pressurized nipple drinking system. So another big question you need to ask or answer is where are you going to put your birds? Are you going to keep them in a coop? Are they going to be on the ground? Are they going to have what kind of access are they going to have? All kinds of options that you can find on the internet, of course. I mean, people have made a chicken coop out of literally everything. I made this one down here in the middle out of an old pallet and some scrap plywood I had, and I put about 20 broilers in it and just moved them from one piece of grass to the next each day. You can buy these real fancy plastic ones. This one will hold I think 5 or 6 chickens, looks like 6 in this case. But they're about $800 a piece for these little plastic ones that you can buy. But again, there's all kinds that are there. There are custom built coops that I've seen. Here's one that's got stained glass windows in it, and a river rock one. Or this one down here is an interesting one. Outside, it's pretty fancy. Inside, there's an actual mural, a barnyard landscape mural Doesn't look like a chicken's ever been in this one, but they can get pretty fancy. But again, it kind of depends on where you're at, where you live, what you want to do, what ordinances might be there that would say what you can do. Typically, this is what you can. What most people, I would say, have. They have a coop with a enclosed run. These are very common, and I think these are probably the best option for a small backyard flock. Some, might have a smaller coop with that also has some outdoor access to run all over the place. Just bear in mind there's greater risk of predation and other things when the birds are outside that enclosed run. Well, another very important part of management is disease basics and biosecurity. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. First off, you need to know just a couple of things about bird anatomy. Even though chickens really don't fly, they still have the same anatomy as other flying birds, and that is that they have these, we call them air sacs, because the lung is tucked up inside of the spinal column along the back. It doesn't expand, contract and expand like ours do. And so they have these air sacs. And so when they breathe, it's a two-step process really for the air come into the air sacs, into the lungs, and then out. And so these air sacs are very fine, very extremely thin material, flesh that's within that bird. And because they're very thin like that, they're very susceptible to respiratory viruses. And so that's why oftentimes bird diseases, chicken diseases, have a respiratory component to them. Now, there are a number of respiratory diseases our birds can get. A couple of them, Newcastle disease and avian influenza, are what we call reportable. In other words, the government needs to know about them because they're extremely dangerous when it comes to the spread and death of birds, even on a national scale. And so, but all these diseases, Newcastle, avian influenza, laryngotracheitis, which is essentially a cold in the throat, bronchitis, mycoplasma, they all have a respiratory component, and often it takes laboratory analysis to know what the difference is. But typically we see facial swelling, discharge from the eyes and from the nose. Usually they have some labored breathing. Sometimes they look like they're have paralysis going on. And so very important that we kind of know what's going on with those birds if they have respiratory disease. Now, we have a lot of information available about avian influenza, particularly in 2015, we had a national emergency with avian influenza in our commercial industry. And so we've put together a web page with a lot of information. And so if you're interested, just search for a UGA avian flu, and I'll take you to this web page, and we have resources that we have, as well as federal, state, and others as well. Now, one thing that's on this web page that we have encouraged our county agents to utilize is this decision guide. So if you have sick birds, first thing you would want to do is call your county agent and have them talk you through this decision guide, and it'll help you decide if we need to get a hold of a laboratory for analysis to make sure we don't have avian influenza. The main thing with this whole web page, or this whole decision guide, is sudden death without any signs. So if you have, let's say you have a flock of 10 birds and they're perfectly fine one day, and you walk out the next day and most of them are dead, that's a problem. And because some of these diseases, particularly avian influenza, can strike that quickly, depending on the strain of the virus. And so very important that we know that. Now, if we need to, certainly we can call the Poultry Veterinary, Georgia Poultry Lab Network. Here's the phone number for that. And they have veterinarians and clinical folks that can help and if need be, can come look at your birds and take some samples. If you actually want to take samples to the lab, you can, or birds to the lab, both live and dead, actually. You need to call ahead though, and particularly if you want to keep the bird, they can make kind of an informal appointment in the parking lot, because if the bird goes into the building, it will not come out alive. Avian influenza is not a direct threat to human health. We don't have that kind of it's not that kind of a virus. And the type of strain that has shown some issues is in very poor third world countries where close physical contact, prolonged contact with birds, living with their birds essentially is the case. And so we really don't have that issue here. And all the products that are grown in Georgia are tested before they go to slaughter. And so there's really no risk of avian influenza virus entering our food supply. And even with proper cooking of eggs and meat, there's no issue there. The most important viral disease I want you to understand and know is Mercs disease. And it is by far the most common disease that we'll see in backyard flocks. And yet it's preventable with a vaccination. Now, once your birds, if they've never been vaccinated and they start developing clinical signs of Mercs disease, which is a worldwide problem, once they show symptoms, there's no going back. It's not treatable, because essentially it's a tumor or a tumor type of disease, cancer, I guess, bird cancer. They don't really get cancer per se, but the result is it gets tumors and inflammation on the nerves, and so it causes paralysis, and the birds become very unthrifty and not living a good life. And it really is the only tumor causing virus that there is a vaccine is available. And if our chicks get vaccinated for it, they will not develop these symptoms. Doesn't mean they won't they won't get an infection and shed virus, but they won't develop the symptoms of it. So the most important thing we can do is make sure that our birds, our chicks, are vaccinated for Mercs disease. One of the issues, though, is a lot of small flocks are not routinely vaccinated. And there are a number of reasons. And I forgot to mention that Dr. Karen Grogan from our vet college helped me with some of these slides. A lot of times there's not a history on the property of disease, but I will tell you that Mercs is such a disease that is something that everybody needs to, I think, vaccinate for. There's a lot of information about the application of vaccines in small flocks too. And then probably the biggest problem is manufacturers of vaccines, they don't sell small doses. They're manufacturing for the commercial application. So all these vaccines that we really our birds would benefit from come in 1,000 or 10,000 dose applications. So that's not practical for small flocks. But there are certainly some flocks that should be vaccinated, particularly breeders or show poultry, birds that are on property that's had a continual problem with a certain disease. Example would be Valpox. And and particularly if you're buying birds from swap meets or auctions or flea markets, if they're young birds, making sure they've been vaccinated for Mercs, I think would be very important. And so really the best way, again, is if you're buying chicks, to buy them from a hatchery that has Mercs vaccination as an option. Oftentimes they'll charge a little extra for it, but it's certainly well worth it, considering that the chances of your birds coming down with Mercs disease is quite high. Like I say, a lot of these products only come in large doses. You can buy Mercs vaccine, and it's really pretty cheap, really, about $20. But you do have to mix it with the diluent, and it does come in 1,000 dose vials. The other viral disease let me check my time, make sure it's quickly going fast. Is very important. It's Valpox. We see this a lot. It's a slow spreading virus, produces lesions outside, and depending on the strain, you can produce lesions on the mouth. This is some quail that have had the Valpox internally, and it causes a lot of respiratory concerns there. It also there's a vaccine for it. This particular virus is spread by mosquitoes, particularly, and other biting insects. So controlling those around your birds can be important as well. So to prevent viral diseases, best thing we do is buy birds and stock from a hatchery that's part of the National Poultry Improvement Program. It's a federal program that helps ensure quality birds. Minimizing wild bird contact. Oftentimes that's where bird viruses get into flocks, is from wild birds that get into the feed or they have access to. And introducing new birds into an existing flock with extreme caution. I'll put extreme in front there. You don't know what, if you buy birds from a flea market or something like that, you have no idea what their history is. They may look perfectly fine, but they may be shedding a virus from a disease that they survived that your current birds have not been exposed to. So you can bring in new birds into your flock, and your existing flock could then come down with a disease that those birds had survived. And so be very careful on how you introduce new birds. I recommend at least 3 or 4 weeks of isolation, just to make sure that they haven't been exposed to something that they're just waiting to start expressing symptoms of. Oh, let's see, let's move on a little bit. Bacterial disease prevention. There are a lot of bacteria out there that kind of come in as a secondary killer from following a virus that birds might have. We're the same way. We might get respiratory virus, and then we get a sinus infection. Well, that's from bacteria that's now been able to grow because of our immune system been weakened by the virus. Same with chickens. And so good management, good sanitation are ways that we can help prevent bacterial infection. Some other notable diseases and conditions that we see in backyard flocks is worms, particularly roundworms, a lot of bumblefoot. Bumblefoot is a staph infection from an injury that they typically get on the bottom of their feet. And that can be difficult to treat, actually, even with antibiotics. Sometimes they'll get gapeworms, which is down here on the lower left. This is a worm that likes to get into the trachea of birds and cause respiratory problems. Coccidia, of course, that's a microparasite, really, protozoa that causes inflammation of the gut and other issues there. So all those things we can see more prominently in birds that have access to the ground, like our small flocks. This past couple of years, particularly this last year, maybe it's because people have been home more and watching their birds, we've had a lot of calls about worms and external parasites. What can we do with worms and lice and mites that we have in our birds? A couple of things that we can do. There are some very effective products, ivermectin, fenbendazole, and other similar products that do very well, but they are not approved for poultry. So I'm not going to give you any recommendations for those. Piperazine is the most frequently used product for worms in birds. And there is a withdrawal for it before you can resume eating eggs or eating meat from treated chickens. So make sure you read the label before you resume consumption if you've treated your birds. And not all medications are going to, treat all types of worms. Some require more stronger medications, and sometimes it might take a veterinary prescription to get that resolved. But sanitation, replacing bedding, and rotating products on a regular basis can help to minimize the impact that worms might have in your backyard flock. Now, ectoparasites, the lice and the mites, probably more of a concern or of a more calls from that than anything else. And again, some of those products are very effective, but they don't have they're not labeled for poultry use. So permethrin spray has been probably the most frequent recommendation for red mites. There's some newer products. One's called Spinosad, which is the brand name is Elector. Very effective. It's a microbial based insecticide. It's very, very effective. It can be part of your rotation. Just remember that when you treat for mites and lice, that you have to do it more than once, because any eggs that are on your bird or within the feathers are not going to be affected by that initial treatment. So you need to follow with a secondary treatment, either 10 to 14 days after that first treatment, in order to kill those insects that are now hatching and kill them before they have a chance to lay eggs as well. Some people ask about dust bathing. I think it's a natural process that chickens use to help rid them and control ectoparasites. And so, I think a good blend would be some wood ash, some sand, and even some diatomaceous earth. If you like that product, I think it has some benefits to it. And so you can make a dust bath that they can use. But I think another very important part is certainly regular coop cleaning will help keep down any external parasites that might be a problem. All right, let's jump on ahead a little bit. We talked about the Poultry Lab. Again, you can take birds there, call ahead. They have a web page there. You can get their phone number. Like I say, they can meet you in the parking lot if you want to keep the bird, take it home. They can take some blood, maybe a nasal swab, but they certainly can only test for certain things based on that. There is another good resource. It's the Merck Vet Manual from the Merck Company. If you go to that web page, you can search for all the poultry diseases and all the different symptoms, treatments, and things, if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper in some of the poultry diseases you might have in your small flock. Biosecurity, we can't not talk about disease prevention without biosecurity. And really all it is common sense. Isolating your birds, controlling who has access to them, and keeping it clean. That's really what it's all about. And the more that we can do that, the more secure they will be from other poultry diseases that might be out there. A couple other things we already talked about, from purchasing from an NPIP source to confinement rearing preferred. We've talked about all those things, but also, in some ways it's important to avoid mixing age groups. In other words, if you have older hens, for example, and you bring in some new hens in your flock, you're kind of asking for problems. Similarly, if you have a brand new flock and you see a couple older pretty hens at the flea market, you want them, it can be a problem. Mixing those age groups can sometimes bring in bad experiences, that diseases that might prove to be a problem. Sometimes mixing species is not a good idea. Waterfowl, for example, often do not get any of these poultry diseases, but they tend to be carriers of disease. And so mixing waterfowl with chickens and turkeys sometimes can be you're going to raise the risk of some disease issues. And then be careful with borrowing equipment and things like that. and especially introducing new birds into a new flock, very important. I like foot baths. Some veterinarians frown on them a little bit, but I think they help to remind us about being biosecure. And if nothing else, having a dedicated pair of shoes for when you take care of your birds might be the number one thing you can do, because often we'll track it in what diseases they might contract. But I do like foot baths. They can help us clean our shoes, our boots, that kind of thing, and a reminder of being biosecure. Pest control also means predators and other things, cats. Look at this picture down here of a raccoon taking an egg right out from underneath the hen. We need to make sure that we are taking care of those concerns and issues as well. This is an interesting one. There's a fox inside a chicken coop climbing up to the rafter to get out. I didn't realize they were that adept, I guess, but they can be a problem in certain areas for sure. And some of the best ways to take care of that is how we, in this case, this is some fencing and how to lay that fencing in the ground and also have it angled so they can't climb over the top. Raptors can be a problem for sure, but probably again, a very important thing is rodent control. We don't want rodents into our feed. We don't want them bringing in diseases or external parasites or worms, those kind of things that our chickens can pick up. So important that we take good control measures for rodents. There are a lot of different things we can do, from removing shelter for them and food to, even the cats and other natural predators can be good things to have as well. But I think it's very important that we, like I say here, clean up and bait down to help keep the rodent control populations down in and around our small flock poultry. Well, I think actually this is my last slide. How about that for a rodent control problem? I visited Australia several years ago looking at some chicken farms, and these were the problems that they were having. These are the wallabies that would come in and around their chicken houses and eat feed and causing some issues. But thankfully, the rats and mice we have here in Georgia aren't that big. Well, I think that's the last slide I've got for management. That's right at about an hour, a little bit longer than I wanted to go. But let's we go ahead and stop the presentation there and take any questions or chat that we might have. And so I'll turn back to you, Carol.
Yeah. All right. So we have a number of questions here for everybody. And I'm going to go back to start at the first question that I've got. So a few of these have been touched on just a little bit. But so the first one we had here is about the all vegetable diet. That in Europe, they use that to prevent the spread of diseases passed through prions. And what is the risk of feeding a backyard flock an omnivorous diet?
Yeah, they places like in Europe where they did have the prion issue, was the mad cow disease that was a problem a number of years ago. We haven't had that issue here, but the theory behind that is that if they don't consume an animal product, then they wouldn't have the access to that. And so I think the vegetable diets kind of took hold there. Animal proteins, birds do very well. They consume them and they can gain a lot of energy from them. So, that's, I think, why we continue to use them here. We haven't had really any documented cases of transfer of prions from animal product to our birds. But, some people do have that concern, and certainly vegetable diets can be formulated to meet the nutritional requirements that chickens would have.
Okay, the next one I've got is how many times a week is it normal to clean the coop?
Well, normal. What's normal? Yeah, that's a good question. What's normal? I mean, if it were me, if I had a small flock of birds, I would let the condition of my manure be an indicator of how often I need to clean. In other words, if the manure is getting too wet and staying wet, if rainwater or something's getting in there, then you're certainly going to want to clean it more often. You don't want your birds having to deal with wet shavings or wet nesting material all the time. So, maybe a couple times a month. Fulton County didn't offer any any advice on, but they were considered frequent. So, I think it's partly how you feel individually, and then let the condition of your coop kind of help dictate how often you need to do that.
The next one I've got is, are there reportable diseases spread by other birds that can carry from a city area? I'm assuming they're meaning pigeons or other kind of wild birds. And wouldn't that be a risk for a flock near an urban area?
Absolutely, it would. Yep. Wild birds often carry the same or can be affected by the same diseases as chickens, kind of depending on the species. But again, a lot of them are carriers of a virus, for example. So that's why even in an urban setting, wild birds can pose a problem.
Is it okay to put a coop in a spot in the yard with no grass and shade?
Yeah, I mean, the only concern I would have is when it would rain, it get a little bit muddy if there's no grass there. So if it were me, I would put down a nice thick layer of shavings or pine bark or something like that, so it doesn't get as muddy. But certainly that would be an appropriate spot.
Lauren's got a comment about the diatomaceous earth. She says it's highly controversial within the poultry community, especially the backyard poultry community, with many people citing that inhalation of the dust is dangerous to birds. Is this correct or an urban myth?
Well, there's a little bit of both there. Certainly, because the product is extremely fine. It can, if it's inhaled either by chickens or particularly more by us, it can cause some respiratory issues. But if you mix it with a different product, like if it's a component of wood ash or sand, I don't think it would be nearly the issue. It functions pretty well as a natural insecticide in how it essentially causes insects to dry out and for their exoskeleton to crack, and then that essentially kills them. So it can function that way, but yeah, you got to be a little careful with it.
Jay had a question about your slide comparing the different feeds. There was a difference for one of them with the vitamin D level. Is that because of the diet and everything else looked the same?
You mean the egg nutrition facts?
I think that was the different feeds.
Different feeds. Did I show some feeds?
Jay, I'm sorry, I'm not sure which slide it was on, but it was from just a minute ago, so it's maybe one of your last couple of slides. I'm not sure. He says yes, the slide comparing 3 different cartons, it was in the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the difference, there can be, essentially there was 2 differences that I didn't really point out. Because fat soluble vitamins, which are vitamin A, D, E, and K, those are fat soluble vitamins even in our own diet. They're fat soluble, so they can be attached to to fat molecules that can be absorbed into the egg yolk. And so you can feed a hen elevated levels of vitamin E and vitamin D, and it will elevate the level of D and E in the egg. And that's why I didn't put the brand name, but there's one brand that that's how they market their eggs. And so they can get about, instead of 1 microgram of vitamin D, they get 6 micrograms in their eggs. So they can elevate it a little bit. And, but in reality, it's, if you're willing to pay that much, if you're willing to pay extra for that, that's fine. It's just not really a big component of your daily intake compared to the amount of money you might spend for it. The other thing too, I want to point out one more thing. Those birds, that have a lot of access to green grass, those pastured birds, the only thing that elevates in them is vitamin A. And so that can come into the egg, and it elevates the egg about, most eggs have about 80 micrograms, really small amount of vitamin A in the yolk. And so feeding on grass elevates them about 10 micrograms, just about 10% of what they have. And so again, if you want to, the difference between the price of a pastured egg, the price you're paying for that 10 micrograms of vitamin A is pretty significant when that's the only difference in the egg. Anyway, long story, but anyway.
All right, I've got just maybe 2 or so more. And so the next one I have was for a new flock, do you recommend hatching chicks or buying chicks?
Well, good question. If you've never hatched chicks before, if you've never raised poultry before, I think I would start out with buying. And then once you have the management down, then you could add the additional layer of incubating and hatching eggs, because it takes more effort for sure. So I think starting right out, I would buy chicks first.
How high is too high for protein in their diet?
Oh, that's a good question. It's often not the problem. Too often, chickens are not fed enough protein. Baby chicks, they need to start out at about 22 to 24% protein. By the time they're a laying hen, they still need about 16% protein. And often folks try to make their own feed or throw a bunch of stuff together to make chicken feed, and it often is way short on protein. And so very important though that those laying hens have at least 16%, and like say 22, 24% for chicks. Going much more than that, you're just throwing money away really, because their protein is the most expensive part of a chicken feed, and they're only going to utilize a certain amount. And so you'll just be throwing away that extra money in extra protein.
Deborah wants to know what would be the best way to get the Mercs vaccination, if they were willing to give it to their birds, and do they have to be treated when they're small, or can they be treated when they're older?
Yeah, the best way, of course, is to if you buy chicks, to have them vaccinated before they are shipped to you. The hatchery will vaccinate them. That's the best way. You don't have to worry about it after that. If you want to buy the vaccine and administer to your own birds, it needs to be early on. The disease generally shows itself within the first 7 months, 2 to 7 months of a bird's life. And so if you don't vaccinate within that time frame and they start showing symptoms, it's too late. So earlier the better. And if you can have the hatchery do it, that's even better still.
Okay, so I've had a couple of comments about the shell thickness. She says that her neighbor's eggs taste good, but the shell feels very thin compared to eggs that she purchases in the store. Or I'm sorry, this is from Jay. Is the thin shell a sign of disease or just a different breed of chicken?
That is probably, if those shells are thinner than the shells that are in the store, that is a pretty good indication they're not getting enough calcium in their diet. Now, chickens are going to use calcium from their body and from their diet to put onto those shells. And so if they have to rely on their body to put all that calcium on, then it's going to be, those shells are going to be thinner, and then they can develop skeletal problems later on. So that to me sounds like they need a supplemental calcium source, part of their diet.
And finally, are there any good books you'd recommend for small flock?
Well, I mean, there are a lot, really. Actually, the backyard chicken, I think it's backyardchicken.com, is a good website. A good website for information, for recommendations, for reading material, and so that's a good one. Chickens Magazine is a good resource, and they also have books and other reading material that's available. We have some on our webpage. We don't have a ton of backyard flock reading material, but we do have some at the university webpage. But there are a couple authors that have written a number of good books on backyard flock chickens, and Gail. I'll send her for our last name, Gail Darrow. Her books are listed on backyardflock.com. Those are all very good books as well.
All right. Well, everyone, if you guys have a couple of moments, please take a couple minutes to fill out my survey. I've dropped the link into the chat box, and that's just a totally voluntary. It only takes 1 or 2 minutes. And I think that's it for this evening. So thank you very much, Dr. Ritz. And if you guys are interested, feel free to tune in next week, same time on Tuesday at 6 o'clock. And I'll go ahead and send a follow-up email through Eventbrite if you guys are interested to sign up for any of the other webinars that we're going to have. Thanks everyone for being attentive and for, paying attention and having good questions.
Yes, thank you.